Welcome to The Flowered Path. This is a kind of bonus episode. If you're listeners to Strange Familiars, you heard this episode back in 2020. This was the Christmas episode I recorded with Brother Richard. I'm going to be repackaging some of my talks I did with Brother Richard over at Strange Familiars for The Flowered Path because I think it's appropriate to our content here. I'll just release them as bonus episodes. If you're not familiar with Brother Richard, he's a Capuchin Franciscan priest friar from Ireland, probably our most popular guest over there at Strange Familiars. Brother Richard has recently released a book. It's called Still Points. It's on meditation and mindfulness. It is available now in the U.S. as an audiobook or as an ebook, but the hardback will be published in January. I think it's available everywhere else. You can get it from your local bookstore or wherever you purchase your books. And we have a new show with Brother Richard coming on Strange Familiars this week. I did want to give a little update. I'm running behind on The Flowered Path because I'm doing research on a show that covers about 8 years of someone's encounters with some pretty amazing things. I don't want to give it away just yet, but it's based on her diary. It's not a saint, it's kind of a mystic, but I think it fits in well with the kind of things we talk about here on The Flowered Path. The problem is it's 8 years of a diary, and every entry almost is relative to what we're talking about. And I want to do a really deep dive on this subject, so it's taking me a long time to do the research and put it together. I've decided I'll probably publish a show on another saint while I'm getting together the research on the long show. That subject will probably be presented over the course of 2 or 3 shows, I think. It'll have to be broken up. It's so much information. I was trying to get it done and have that be the next show. I don't think that's going to happen. I think I'm going to have to intersperse some other saints in between those shows. But it has put me behind on the research. I do all the research and presentation for The Flowered Path myself. I try not to just read a Wikipedia page or something like that on the saint. I try to do my own research and try to get as much information as I can. So each show takes me a good bit of time to put together. I appreciate you being patient with me. I did want to release something for Christmas, so here we have this repackaged show from Strange Familiars from 2020. Brother Richard and I discuss the Three Magi, Mary Magdalene, the Holy Grail, the origins of Christmas, and more. It's a long show. Strange Familiars is a paranormal podcast. We get into some talk on some paranormal subject as well, but I think you will enjoy it. It's definitely not too far off the path of things we talk about here on The Flowered Path. Please be patient with me. There will be new Flowered Path as soon as I can get the shows ready. I did release the first Flowered Path patron show over on our Patreon, so Flowered Path patrons did get a show last week. If you want to hear that and support what I'm doing with The Flowered Path, you can go to patreon.com/thefloweredpath. All right, let's go ahead and get into this long talk I had with Brother Richard in 2020. I guess before the questions that other people submitted, I always have this fascination with what we call here Old Christmas, which is basically it's just the date Christmas was celebrated. What, before, I forget was it before the Gregorian calendar? I forget.
The Gregorian calendar, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's we're with at the moment, yeah.
And some people, some traditions held on to it and remembered it, and other people just, when December 25th kind of became the official Christmas date, it kind of faded from some other traditions. Does the church or do you individually acknowledge Old Christmas in any ways or any sort of celebration or feast associated with that?
You're talking about the 6th of January, are you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So for us, that's the Epiphany. So it's sort of the 12th night. It's the marker of the end of the Christmas period proper as such. And there were lots of traditions around it. Decorations in the house were supposed to be taken down on 12th night. It was considered very bad luck to leave them up in the house after the 12th. It was also in Ireland known as Nullag Naman in Gaelic, which was the women's Christmas or Little Christmas. And the idea there was that the women, having worked extremely hard and to to cook and to provide for all the festivities. This was the day when they were allowed to rest, and it was up to the men to cook and to clean on that day. A kind of a sort of a reversal. Though, as most women will tell you, they immediately noticed that the men got 12 days and they got one, which is the usual proportion, sadly, in terms of honouring. But it was honoured, and it was also a day in which women very often made pilgrimages together to holy wells or to holy trees, etc. And as to what transpired there, I don't know. I'm not being part of that gender, but it was considered a very special and a very sacred time. Within the Christian calendar, it is the day in which we would commemorate the baptism of Christ, the miracle of the wedding feast at Cana, and the visit of the Magi, the three wise men. So in places where the Christmas crib or creche was placed, that was the day on which the three wise men arrived and were placed into the crib if they hadn't been placed there already. So I think we'll be talking about the Magi later. So there's a lot about the Magi and their significance. But Epiphany comes from the Greek epiphanoia, which means a showing forth or a revealing. And the idea was that while Christmas was the revelation to the shepherds and to the people of Israel, the Epiphany was the showing forth of the Christ to the whole world. So we have the first of his public signs as an adult, the turning of the water into wine at Cana. We have the first kind of revelation of the Trinity with the baptism of Christ in the waters of the Jordan, in which was also seen as a rendering of all water as a holy and sacred and healing element from then on, and was even seen as a sort of a casting out of any sort of negative spirits that would have been in water, so that water was considered a very sacred element from that moment. And then the third point then, as I say, was the Magi. So you have the in inverted commas, the pagan peoples, as they would have been seen in the old traditions, coming and making their adoration of the Christ as well, and that their faiths and their traditions had pointed them towards the coming of the Christ. So that was the old date. In the Orthodox Christian tradition, in the Eastern tradition, that would still be the main day on which the birth of Christ is also celebrated on that day. So all of those mysteries would have been celebrated together. So they kind of held on to the old while they moved on to the newer calendar of the Gregorian, which was also made to illustrate, I suppose, the sort of the use of the whole year as a kind of a catechetical tool or teaching tool. So the reason we choose 25th of December is for two reasons. Number one is the nearness to the winter solstice and the great Roman pagan feast of Sol Invictus, which was the victorious sun. So the sun, as in S-U-N, was seen to die in the pagan mysteries on the shortest day of the year. And then there were a number of days of mourning for the sun. And then by the 25th, of course, the sun is beginning to appear again over the horizon. And so the sun is seen to be victorious. And that was one of the most important feasts in the classical religions. And so when Christianity came about, it was seen that this feast presaged or prefigured the coming of the sun, S-O-N, in that sense. And so the feast of Christmas began to be celebrated quite publicly from about the 300s, round about that festival, that date.
Do they refer to it as Old Christmas Day there as well?
Little Christmas.
Okay.
Little Christmas. Yeah, and a lot of big celebration there for that. Yeah.
Folklorically speaking, like I've noticed just in folklore and collecting stories and stuff, folk songs and so forth, there's almost a mystical quality assigned to old Christmas. Like for those who remembered it, okay, we have Christmas, but there's also old Christmas as well. Which
it's kind of an echo in the background. Absolutely. And it was seen as a very, very liminal space. As I say, first of all, you had the reversal of the genders going on. Mm-hmm. You had the visits to the old places, the wells and the trees and those kind of sacred places. Often monastic ruins were often visited on those days as well. They were kind of pilgrimages and pattern days. You have the arrival of these mystics, these three great mystics, the three Magi, and so it was one of those times in which I suppose a thin time in that sense, when the dead were also very often commemorated on the Epiphany, and it would have, I suppose, linked into the kind of the ending of the solstice, the turning towards the light again. All of those kind of things would still echo within that old Christmas day.
So we'll get to some of the questions that people submitted now. This says, this is from Taylor. He said, for both Tim and Brother Richard, what are some scary Christmas stories that have impressed or shocked you, if any? And we'll start with that one. For me, it's you guys can go back and listen to the Belsnickel episode. The fact that these wild men are so closely associated with the holidays, and again, my chapters on the wild men and Christmas and where the footprints end and so forth. I think I've talked about that at some length. Very, very interesting that these sort of all over Europe and in America, in those communities like the Pennsylvania Dutch community here, there's people that have these folkloric ties to Europe. These folkloric wild men are just associated with Christmas so closely. Very, very interesting to me.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, and the sort of bringing together those various wild men and kind of punishing figures, I suppose, and then bringing them into the company of Saint Nicholas, of Santa Claus as well, is fascinating. The idea that they are in some way his kind of retinue as he goes around. They've been scrubbed from the record somewhat. Officially, but the idea of Christmas as a kind of a wild time, as a time of wildness and encountering the wild, both in humanity and in the kind of spirits of the land or the spirits of the other, is quite a present one. Within the Irish tradition, there are lots of stories of encounters, particularly with the kind of the fairy world around about Christmas, and also the lament. Very often of the fairies, that they were sort of on the outside of these celebrations, that they couldn't partake of it or be part of it.
That's very
yeah. There was that was quite often done, and in fact, they were one of the times in which it was very easy to see them. They had all of these kind of rituals, particularly with regard to the clergy. It was supposed to be on Christmas Eve that if you managed to get a hold of a saddle that had been used by a priest and put your foot in the stirrup, while putting your other foot on fairy ground, you would be able to see the fairies. And for those kind of clergy who were considered to be holier, if they made a loop or a ring with their arm touching their hip, and you looked through it towards a fairy mound, you were supposed to be able to see the fairies on Christmas Eve as well. So there was this idea of that while we have silent night and all is peaceful and all is quiet, there was this idea that there was a great upheaval, that Christmas brings a great upheaval, a great shift, a great movement with regard to the spiritual world. And even within the very earliest monastic texts, one work that's known as the Sayings of the Desert Fathers, there's a wonderful story about St. Anthony of the Desert, who's one of the very, very early monastic saints. And he meets a satyr in the desert, a wild man, and he's described as one of the classical satyrs, who tells him that he also needs to have the gospel preached to him, and that they have been waiting for the revelation to come to them as well. And so the Saint Anthony sits down and teaches him, tells him the story of the Christ and the coming of the Christ. So it's a sort of a theme that's present from the very beginning, all the way through. Yeah. You'll find that in the very early chapters of the Sayings of the Desert Fathers. And what's lovely about it is St. Anthony is on his way somewhere else and kind of meets this guy in the middle of the desert who asks him to stop. And he's kind of, he's not in any way disturbed by the fact that he's meeting a satyr in the middle of the desert. He's just annoyed that he can't get on to his appointment. So it's one of those things, again, the old fairy idea of, you'll be stopped on the road and not to pass that which is in need is a very important Christmas point. I suppose if you're looking for a scary Christmas story, I'm not entirely sure whether it's scary or not. I encountered myself some years ago a house that a young couple had bought. They were friends of one of the other friars, and they were having a little bit of issue with one of their youngest children, who kept telling them that there was a man in a brown coat who was walking around the house and was very annoyed that they had moved in. So they had, they kind of took it with a little bit of salt at the start, and thought it was kind of cute, and that the child had a bit of an imaginary friend going on or whatever. And as the days went on, the child continued to talk about the man in the brown coat, who was getting progressively more annoyed as they moved furniture and kind of painted places and restored the place. So it was beginning to creep the mother out a little bit, in fact. And when the child wasn't there, she had kind of feelings that maybe, she was sort of being watched, or those kind of feelings of other presences. So on one occasion then, they had moved a very large, we'd call it a tall boy, a kind of a large chest of drawers, one of those old kind of dresser drawers. She had moved that into a place on a landing outside the child's bedroom, and the child kept telling them as they were moving it that the old man did not want the chest of drawers there. So at that stage, the parents got kind of annoyed and gave out to the child and sent her to bed and said, there's enough of that now. We're finished. The man in the brown coat is gone. He's not to be there anymore. Anyway, about 2-3 o'clock in the morning, this was coming towards Christmas, the child came into their room and said the man in the brown coat was outside on the landing and wanted to talk to them, and he was very annoyed as to where they had put his chest of drawers. So the parents came out anyway and told the child to go back to bed, and the mother said, "For the last time, there is no such thing as the man in the brown coat." And at that moment, the chest of drawers fell over. So at that point, they decided maybe they needed to seek a little bit of assistance, and they reached out to their friend, who was one of the monks, one of the friars, and he got in touch with me, and the two of us went out to see them, to see the house and to bless the house. And while we were there, there was a palpable presence in the house. Like, it was just, it didn't reject us, but we knew it knew we were there. There was a very strong sense of kind of oppression. So we chatted to the little girl, and she was fine. She was chatting away, all 6 years of age of her, and she was saying he's very nice, but he doesn't like us being here, and it's his house. So we asked for his name, and she said, "Oh, I never asked his name." So she went off and came back a little bit later, and she said she'd asked his name, and she gave us his name. So we asked the parents, did the name mean anything to them? It meant nothing to them. So I said, okay. So we continued with the rituals and prayers, and the oppression kind of left. And we said, look, if there's any more problems, call us back, but we think he's gone. So about 2 or 3 days later, the father in the house was putting the rubbish out, taking the garbage out. And he met one of the old neighbours on the street. And the old man, being a good old man, had noticed these two monks arriving to the house some days before, and was very curious as to what was going on. So he was asking him what was going on. And the younger man who was in the house, didn't particularly want to go into the fact that about his daughter or the man in the brown coat or anything. So he said to him, the young man said to the old man, have you had anything strange in your house? And he said, oh yeah, we all have. He said these houses were built by a man back in the 1920s or 30s. But he said he's never really left. He's always been around. And lots of the houses have had problems with him. So the young man was totally taken aback by this. This was not on the realtor had not spoken about this as they'd bought their house. So he asked the old man what was the name of the man who had built the houses, and the name he was given back was the name that the little girl had produced a couple of nights before. So that was just coming up to Christmas, and what was beautiful about it was the neighbours all began to call into them to tell them that all of the manifestations in their houses had also stopped from the time that we had visited and offered the prayers for the man who had obviously felt very possessive of these houses he had built and wanted furniture and decor to remain the same. So that was a lovely moment of. And I'd certainly say to your listeners as well, if they have younger children who are talking about invisible friends, to really listen to them, because there's often they are just what we think they are in terms of children's imaginations, but we know the power of the imagination, and it can certainly be used as ways of connecting with other things. We have a fashion here at the moment. I don't know if it's reached the States, but it's certainly a fashion at the moment where children are invited to put up fairy doors in their rooms or in their houses or in their gardens, and to sort of name a fairy and to call on the fairy to come in. And it's, these beautiful, pretty little doors are sold to stick to your wall or to stick to the garden wall. And I'm waiting for the wave of calls we will get. They're making effectively little shrines, right, to genius loci of some description, and I've no doubt that some of them will move in, or at least manifest. When parents say to me that they're picking these things up for their kids, I kind of smile away and say, okay, well, enjoy. And we'll see how it goes, because I think particularly when a child names something and calls it in, it can arrive. It can come in with it. So, yeah.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples is there's a very popular Bigfoot museum in Georgia, and they put up this museum and filled it with Bigfoot artifacts and pictures of Bigfoot, and it's a place where people come to share their stories about Bigfoot. And they even have a very large piece of presumed Bigfoot scat under glass there. So
lovely.
And then suddenly they're getting tons of sightings around this, and it's like,
sure,
yeah, you want Bigfoot? You just build a temple to Bigfoot, essentially.
They've called it in. There's a paranormal researcher in the UK called Mike Hallowell, and he has written a beautiful book called Invisi Kids, which is specifically on the invisible friend phenomena. And he has related it hugely to the Fae, particularly, as a kind of a working hypothesis. He has designated invisible friends as what he calls quasi-corporeal companions, which is a lovely phrase.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Particularly around things like, them being invisible and intangible and yet able to affect matter at times. And it is fascinating. We had one case, I remember, I didn't deal with it personally, it was another friar dealt with it, but where there was a child there was a long corridor, and she used to roll the ball along the corridor to her friend, who would then roll it back.
Ooh, yeah.
So when the mother spotted this happening, she quickly called somebody in to ask, in as politely a way as possible, for them to kind of move on and leave her friend, leave her daughter alone. So yeah.
The tradition of Christmas ghost stories is very, very strong, and has faded over. I think I tend to blame Coca-Cola and the sort of saccharine nature of modern Christmas. Yeah. It was a very strong tradition of Christmas ghost stories going back hundreds and hundreds of years. It didn't start with Dickens in any means.
No, and very, very strong in Ireland. The idea of sitting around the fire, particularly on the nights of Christmas not just being one night but 12 nights, and each night kind of the story is getting more and more crazy about the fairies and the ghosts and all of that kind of stuff that was on the land. And there was even the tradition of what was called the Christmas invitation, which was considered a very, very great blessing for someone to die over the 12 nights of Christmas. Again, right up until quite recently here in Ireland, there would have been what they called the tradition of reading the death. In other words, that they would tell the story of the death specifically looking for the signs that had come before it or around it, so that people would sort of learn how to know when death was near, and how to know when to prepare oneself for death, particularly. So considered a very great blessing to die over that time, and that those stories would get told over and over and over within families. And most old Irish families would have particular sort of sign givers that would appear from the animal or bird world. Various families were associated with foxes. my own mother's family was associated with the blackbird particularly, and to this day we have had really interesting manifestations of blackbirds just before the women of the family have passed on, where they would just be around and be very present and coming into houses and all of that kind of stuff. It was a time for the ghosts. It was a time for spirits, and the understanding was as well that it was a time for mercy for the spirits. So particularly for those that were trapped or were caught or were condemned to kind of wander the world, if they could be invited in to Christmas celebrations, then their sufferings would be alleviated, and they would even be able to pass on into the more heavenly realms. And so over Christmas Eve particularly, there was always the idea that a candle would be set in the window and the doors would be left unlocked that night, and very often bread and milk would be left on the tables, in some places bread and beer, and that the idea there was that if the Holy Family, Jesus, Mary and Joseph, were on their journey, they could call in, but also the ancestors could call in at any time and partake of food and drink and know that they were welcome. So it wasn't just the stories, it was the understanding that they would call, that they would be present.
That is a beautiful tradition. And it kind of segues into Taylor's next question, asking about Christmas rituals of the future or rituals we'd like to see come back into vogue. That's an absolutely beautiful one. I would like to see implemented.
Yeah. Well, the Christmas welcome. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea of hospitality, not just to our family and our friends, but also to those who have gone before. And there was that idea of a kind of a telescoping of events. That idea that when you entered into sacred time, into thin time, eternity and chronological time become one in that moment, and so all of the generations are present. And it becomes a way of kind of renewing our acquaintance with those who have gone before. They'd often be invited to bless the land or bless the house, or to make sure that the house was protected for the coming year. In terms of other rituals that maybe have gone, I mean, they're often present, but we don't know why we're doing them. So even the idea of bringing in holly and ivy into the house, that was a very, very clear protection of the house against evil spirits or fairy. And the holly bough was considered to be a very sacred plant, going back as far as the Celtic times, but even under the Christian dispensation as well. It was seen as one of the plants that had been used within the crown of thorns. And so a male and female holly tree were often planted at the main entrance to a garden or to a house as a way of keeping evil spirits at bay. And so branches of it would be brought in and placed over the door and over the chimney. And we still do that to decorate, but we forget why it was actually done. It was to protect the house at a time when the spirits would be out and about and moving, so that only the good ones could come in, because they couldn't pass a holly bough or a holly branch at that stage.
Wow. I have chills. We have 2 holly trees planted out front.
Well, there you go. It was always considered to be a very good sign if you were moving house, if you came to the house and discovered that holly trees had been planted. It was a sign of blessing of a house.
Oh, wonderful.
In fact, Tolkien even referred to the tradition with regard to holly, when in the Lord of the Rings they arrive at the famous the doors into the mines of Moria. They discover 2 huge holly trees that had been planted there of old as a way of keeping evil things at bay, but also as a way of announcing an alliance between the dwarves and the elves, I think it was at that stage. But it goes back to that ancient idea that the trees were markers for memory, and were also markers of they brought particular energies with them. Whereas ivy was seen as a very blessed plant, because it's in the old language of plants, it was considered to be a healing plant, and a plant that indicated humility. And when the old Irish legends around the Christmas time, when the Holy Family were fleeing into Egypt, they were supposed to have hidden in a cave, and ivy grew over the front of the cave to hide them from the soldiers. And so ivy was considered to be a very blessed plant to have in the house as well at that time.
I think the Christmas welcome might hold to kind of step back and touch on that again, might hold particular significance this year when maybe we can't see as many of our relatives as we'd like under this, and maybe that'd be a way to sort of acknowledge our relatives past and present.
Yeah, it really is a beautiful idea, and the idea of kind of setting out food. Now, the only thing, and I would just say to anybody who's going to do it, food that was left out for the holy ones or for the dead was never consumed by the living then afterwards.
Yes,
it was always distributed out to the land so that the animals could take it, or it could go back into the land in whatever way it needed to. It was considered to be untouchable by humans after that. But I mean, that was it. The latch was left off the door. The lamp was left in the window. And to this day, in many of the churches in Ireland, when it comes to Christmas Eve, there'll often be a special lamp or candle lit in the church for those who can't make it home. We're a country of emigrants. And so it wasn't until very recently, that people would kind of come home again for holidays or for Christmases. They couldn't afford to, and travel was too difficult. So lamps would often be lit in houses or in the windows of houses and churches as a reminder of those of the parish who had gone elsewhere. It might be a nice thing to do in these days when maybe people can't travel or don't want to break lockdowns or don't want to bring the possibility of difficulty on older family members, etc., who might be feeling isolated at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you kind of hit on this with the Sol Invictus stuff, but Alexander was wondering about the pagan origins of Christmas. Again, I don't know if you want to expand on that any further. And
well, I suppose I think it's always dangerous to become kind of syncretistic about these things, as though you're sort of saying it's all one thing, because I think that takes away maybe from the individual inspiration of the different traditions as well. But I mean, I suppose as human beings, there is a very simple longing for light over darkness. We feel safer in the day, by and large, and particularly when you're dealing with an agricultural population in the northern hemisphere. The importance of light for even just simply for food production becomes absolutely essential. So all of the various traditions have their festivals of light. I think tonight, as far as I know, is the first night of Hanukkah this year. I could be wrong on that, but I think it's tonight. You've Diwali in the Hindu tradition, and all of the various fire and light ceremonies that happen throughout the year. I think what Christianity did when it met with the pagan celebrations or the older classical celebrations was what it did in most places, which was to say, well, anyone who is seeking for the truth is seeking for the divine, whether they know it or not. And so anything that's good within those celebrations was preserved and continued. So certainly there were elements of the older pagan celebrations that were sublimated or received by the Christian tradition and kind of given other significances or deeper significances, or newer significances, perhaps to say, maybe not deeper, but newer certainly. And as I say, the great festival in Rome, the Saturnalian festival of the victory of the sun, was one that Christianity then took on and said, yes, you were absolutely right to celebrate this, and that this was a prophecy or a prefigurement of what actually happened within the Christian tradition. That was the way it was viewed within the tradition anyway. So I think there is a deep richness to these traditions, that when we scratch the surface, they go deeper and deeper and deeper, and eventually they just become essentially human. The way in which we deal with the natural world and the other and the divine and all of those things is certainly partly a journey from darkness to light and from light back into darkness again, and this kind of cyclic nature of the year. One of the oldest ways of seeing this envisioned, I suppose, is within the Christian tradition. We have the practice of what's known as the Advent wreath, which is a wreath of evergreen leaves that's brought into the church when we begin the Advent season, the 4 weeks of preparation for Christmas. And on each of the 4 Sundays then, a candle is lit around the wreath. And there's all kinds of symbolism associated with it. The evergreen leaves are supposed to represent the evergreen divine, the life of the divine life that lies beneath the surface, even in the midst of dark or desolate winter days. The emptiness of the center of the wreaths is supposed to indicate, divine emptiness, the inability of humanity to comprehend the mystery of God. And then the lighting of the 4 candles indicates the sort of the 4,000 years of longing from the moment that the Messiah is prophesied to the moment that the Messiah arrives. So you have all of these kind of elements of the growing of light, the circling of the ages, the evergreen idea. But all of those traditions are present within the pagan tradition as well. Going as far back as the Yule log and the idea of burning the wood from last year so as to liberate life into the land again, to bring life out of the land again. So I think when the various Christian missionaries and saints, etc., found these things, that they were very well able to see within them the possibility of a deeper illumination even of their own mystery. So I think there was back and forth over the hundreds of years that have celebrated. We've kind of reinformed and reseeded each other along the way.
Did you study, as part of your religious education, do you study pre-Christian religions?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's considered essential. So the formal studies as such that we would do, apart from the in-house kind of apprenticeship and working within our own specifically Franciscan tradition, we would also, all of us, do kind of college level degrees in philosophy and theology. So I spent about 4 years doing a degree in pure philosophy and then 4 years doing a degree in theology, also taking other courses along the way. But in both the philosophy degrees and the theology degrees, part of it was a full kind of very deep study of not just the Christian tradition, but all of the other major traditions, and going back into what were known as the pre-philosophical religions. So that would have been back to the kind of animist, naturist, pagan traditions that were present. I also personally have made a fairly solid study of Buddhism and Taoism as well, and a little bit in terms of Judaism. But it was part and parcel of the courses that you would have to cover all of these traditions as well, and cover them from a very respectful point of view of recognizing that all of these traditions represent the reaching out of humanity for meaning, for ultimate meaning. Obviously, I come from the Christian tradition, and within that, the Catholic tradition, and that's where I am and what I am and how I've chosen to be. But if that tradition is lived fully, it should be lived in the fullest sense of the word Catholic, which means universal, the recognition of truth wherever it's found.
All right, so let's move on to Jen's question. She wants to talk about Mary Magdalene and
okay, very good.
Mysticism surrounding Mary Magdalene.
Okay, where do we start? So I suppose starting from the historical, scriptural point of view, from that point of view, we know very little about Mary Magdalene, other than she's named as one of the female disciples of Christ. She is Mary of Magdala, and I think, as far as we know now, Magdala was a small town which was famous for a tower, a Roman tower. So Mary is often known as Mary of the Tower, or Mary the Tower, even, indicating her kind of strength and courage. She is conflated and even confused with two other women within the gospel narrative sometimes. Mary of Bethany, who's the sister of Lazarus and Martha, and also the woman who is traditionally known as the woman caught in adultery. A name is never actually given to that lady. So over time, and particularly through the medieval pageant play tradition, these three Marys were seen as one, which led, unfortunately, to the idea of Mary Magdalene as being a sort of a fallen woman or a repentant woman, or that kind of idea. Whereas what we actually see in the scriptures is that Mary is named as a disciple, and the only other information we're given is that we're told that Christ cast 7 demons from her. And that's it. That's all that we're told. After that, we see her as an extremely faithful disciple, a companion of Mary, the mother of Jesus. She's present at the crucifixion, and she is gifted as being not the first witness to the resurrection, but the first public witness to the resurrection. It was a very ancient tradition in Christianity that the reason Christ isn't at the tomb when Mary of Magdala arrives first is that the first place he went after rising was to visit his mother, to I suppose console her after her having gone through the suffering of seeing him die. That's known as one of the unknown mysteries. So then Mary of Magdala becomes the first public witness and is given the commission to go and to tell the disciples what she has seen. And since that day, she has received the title in the Christian tradition of the apostle to the apostles. The word apostle means someone who is sent. So she is sent to the apostles to give the mystery, to give the proclamation of the mystery of the resurrection. After that, we simply have traditions and legends. And the traditions and legends say that Mary, along with Lazarus and Martha, this goes back to the conflation of her with Mary of Bethany, and she may have been the same person, we just don't know, that they were exiled as part of the persecution of the early Christians. They wanted to get rid of Lazarus particularly because he was seen as huge evidence of the power of Christ, he having been raised from the dead, and that they were eventually end up in the south of France, where they proclaim Christianity and work various miracles. Martha slays a dragon. Lazarus sets up a kind of a church or a monastery. And Mary of Magdala, we are told, withdraws to the mountains, to the desert, to be a person of contemplation and prayer. And that's where I think maybe the Strange Familiars people become very interested, because we're told that she becomes effectively a kind of an image of the wild, of wild nature. It's said that she lived out in the desert for so long that the clothes that she had fell apart. And so she was gifted with the grace of, depending on the translation you read, her hair becoming so long that it covered her body, or that her body grew hair. And so she's this kind of wild woman of prayer and mysticism and miracles. We're told that daily she was raised up into the sky above the desert by angels, so that she could hear the sacred music of the spheres, the background divine music of all of creation. So effectively she's seen as the sort of having reached the acme of the contemplative journey, and to this day is considered a model of anyone who wants to follow the sort of the hermit way or the contemplative way. Again, more echoes for Strange Familiars there.
Yes.
Her bones and remains and some of her hair are still kept to this day in Provence in France, and there's huge devotion to her there. She also then begins to reappear in the sort of the more Gnostic tradition that begins to arise really in the writings of the early 1900s or so. And this is a sort of a reappraisal of her, and this is where we begin to get the sort of the Da Vinci Code, Mary Magdalene, who appears as possibly the wife of Christ, who appears as the carrier of his bloodline. There's all of those kind of theories that are out there. Now, my problem in speaking about those is that for those who believe in those Magdalene mysteries, well, I'm speaking as a Catholic, and I'm speaking as a Catholic monk, so anything I say after this could very easily be dismissed. So all I'm simply going to say is, if that is the Mary Magdalene that you are interested in, then I would suggest that you just go and study the history, like seek the truth. And you know, if that is helpful to you, that's as much as I can say on it. What I would say about her is that she is one of the most important saints there is, one of the most important female figures at the start of Christianity. Certainly, her life and reputation were impugned by male teachers along the way who wanted to render her a kind of a sacred prostitute idea, I suppose, or a reformed prostitute, which there is no evidence that she was ever anything like that in the scriptures. And instead, if we look at the early church, she's just held up as an extraordinary example of virtue and grace and prayer and miracle working, and someone who is to be emulated by everyone, male and female alike. So yeah, I'd say that's Mary of Magdala from the mystical point of view. As an archetype, she continues to be one of the great, strong archetypes of what we would call the divine feminine, or the feminine in God, often seen within the early, with late Jewish tradition and early Christian tradition as Chochmah or wisdom, Hagia Sophia in the Greek. And that idea, again, that there are two paths to the divine. There is the path of what they call the conversi, those who convert in life along the way and reform their way of living, and the oblati, those who live a life of innocence and purity and truth from the beginning. Interestingly, it was often said that a monastery only worked properly if it had an equal number of conversi and oblati. You needed to have people who knew the world as well as those who had walked away from it.
That's
to keep it going.
That's actually very wonderful.
Yeah, it's a good balance.
Allison is chiming in from the background and asking, which one are you?
Both. That's what I'd say. Particularly, depending on what day of the week you meet me on. But it's definitely again, like with all archetypes, we find all of the archetypes in ourselves. Depending on the circumstances we're in. But Mary of Magdala would have been seen as the archetype of the conversi, whereas Mary, the mother of Jesus, would have been seen as the archetype of the oblati in that sense. So the fact that they both appear at the foot of the cross and they are both the witnesses to the death and the resurrection of Jesus is seen as the sort of fulfillment of both sides, that these are the two paths and that everybody can walk those two paths. There's always room in that sense.
There you go. I will step back and just talk about the idea. Pre-Da Vinci Code, I became interested in these ideas and very, did a ton of research and all these books and everything. The balloon was kind of deflated for me when my bandmate, and I'm talking, these people, they claim to have like the bloodline of Christ, and I'm getting into all this stuff, and then he simply showed me the family tree of some of these royals, and this was sort of the it's a fascinating story, but as far as me going any deeper, this is sort of the end of it. When you look at the family trees of these royals, and they'll go back, and they, it's got, as far as people could remember at the time, their father, their grandfather, maybe their grandfather's grandfather. Beyond that, it goes to pagan gods. Zeus is often in the tree, and great heroes, Hercules and Perseus, and it goes back from there, and then it's figures from the Bible.
Yeah.
Beyond that, so once you see these family trees that people put so much stock in, you go, oh yeah, they just weren't really good at doing family trees back then.
Well, I think there was certainly a sense in which they were trying to reconcile both the pagan and the Christian, so there was always that question, even for the early Christians, as to these figures of myth and legend, where did they fit in? So you even have them stretching it towards one of the famous interpretations of the Nephilim was that they were the classical heroes, the Hercules and all of these kind of people were these, because how else could they have been? How else could they have existed? But I think for me, one of the things that always makes me slightly suspect is that once you get into a situation where you are saying, by virtue of blood or genetic descent, someone is more special than another person. At that point, the hackles on the back of my neck rise, and I think you begin to be very wary, because you're effectively into a kind of a hierarchy of humanity based purely on genetic descent. And we all know where that goes. It becomes racism, it becomes eugenics, it becomes Nazism, it becomes all of those sort of things. And while it would be lovely to think that there is, a pure bloodline of divine bloodline all the way through, the actual message of Christianity in its fundamental sense is that we are all one family with the divine. and that was what the incarnation was to do, was to make us brothers and sisters to the divine. So I think sometimes it can be people wanting to be more special, or to sort of be able to set themselves up over others. Now that happens within organized religion as well, just from the simple kind of hierarchy. There's a very old story one of our old masters used to teach, where he said, there were two apples on a branch and they're looking down at all of humanity, and one apple says to the other, those human beings, all they do is fight and kill and fight and kill, and eventually they're going to be gone, and then finally we apples will take over the world. And the other apple says, yes, but which of us will be in charge, the red ones or the green ones? In other words, it's part and parcel of the kind of fallen nature that exists, that we constantly want to exert dominance over each other. And I think sometimes these kind of legends can be used to sort of give a reason or a philosophy to be able to do that. And we need to be very careful of that, whether it's the Grail quest, the Da Vinci Code, or even just broad mainstream religion in itself.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of the Grail, Barbara asks about the mystic tradition of the Grail within Christianity.
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, the question I respond to whenever anybody asks me about the Grail is, which Grail? Because there are many Grails. I suppose the one most traditionally understood is the idea of the cup of the Last Supper. So for those who may not know, within Christianity, in all its various forms, one of the most important moments in the life of Christ is the Last Supper that he has with his disciples before he dies, at which he offers the sacrifice of Passover, the Jewish Passover sacrifice. Within that meal, within that ritual meal, there is a cup known as the cup of thanksgiving. And that cup was very, very important. It was often, the physical cup itself was often handed down through generations, and was considered something very precious. So one could see it as being something that would have been passed down amongst the disciples afterwards. In time, that became known as the Graal, or the Grail, which basically means a hollow vessel. And that cup, within legend anyway, was something that was passed down amongst the disciples. It was in the keeping of St. Peter, and was with him in Rome, and he used it to celebrate Eucharist regularly. To this day, there is actually an indication of that in the Catholic Mass, because in the Eucharistic prayers that are used, the first Eucharistic prayer that's known as the Roman canon, it goes back, elements of it go back to the 2nd century. When it comes to the moment where the priest takes up the chalice to offer the chalice, in all of the other prayers he just simply says he took the cup, but in the Roman canon he says he took this cup, and that is considered to be an indication that in the words of Peter, he was showing the disciples, the rest of the disciples, the actual cup of Christ in that moment. Now, what becomes of that cup afterwards, that's a matter of mixtures of history and legend, but the story is that it came down eventually to the deacon Lawrence, Saint Lawrence, patron saint of bakers, and Lawrence, as a martyr, took it to Spain, and it was hidden with the Christians in Spain during an outbreak of persecution in Rome. And that chalice still exists to this day. You can see it if you want to Google at any stage the Holy Chalice of Valencia. You'll see a very strange Baroque looking chalice, but if you look closely, the Grail part of it is simply a little stone drinking bowl, which is the cup of the chalice itself, and that is considered to be the chalice that came from Peter, and that was the drinking cup. Now, scientists have looked at it and they have said that it is definitely a 1st century drinking vessel from the Middle East. That's as much as they can say. Mm-hmm. And after that, who knows? But it is exposed regularly in the cathedral in Valencia as a good candidate for the Grail. Put it like that. The second Grail is the Arthurian Grail, the sort of the Arthurian legend, and that is a cup that belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. It's often confused with the Grail of the Last Supper as well. But the cup of Joseph of Arimathea was supposed to have been a cup that was used to collect some of the drops of blood that fell from Christ when he was on the cross. And so it was considered a great symbol of the redemption, as one could imagine. Once we leave the gospel narratives, Joseph of Arimathea becomes a man of great legend. He's supposed to have been a very wealthy man. He was supposed to have made his money through tin mining. He is supposed to have gone to Cornwall and to the UK, which obviously would have been part of the Roman Empire at the time anyway, parts of Britain, to obtain tin. And when the persecution of the church in Jerusalem began to take place, he is supposed to have fled to England and to eventually have ended up in Glastonbury. And if you ever have the chance to get to Glastonbury, I would thoroughly encourage it. I've been there twice now on pilgrimage myself. It's an extraordinary place, and a real place where all of the various traditions come together, and where you can meet literally anything and anyone. It's an extraordinary place for gathering of people there. But the belief there is that Joseph used the Grail to bless the waters of Glastonbury. And you can still go to what's known as the Chalice Well Gardens there and see the well and the spring of water that Joseph blessed, along with planting his staff on Glastonbury Hill, which then became the famous Glastonbury thorn tree, a healing tree. There are a number of them around that are taken from cuttings of it. Sadly, the one on Glastonbury Hill, I think, was actually cut down by vandals some years ago.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah, it was terrible. And but thankfully the tree itself continues, because cuttings are taken from it regularly in order to keep it going. Mm-hmm. And there's one still growing within the grounds of Glastonbury Abbey, which is also supposed to be the resting place of King Arthur as well. So you have all of this mishmash of biblical and Arthurian legend there. But I think the question that was asked was about the Grail in Christian mysticism. And from that point of view, the Grail is you. You are the Grail. So the Grail is a vessel that is hollowed out so as to contain the lifeblood of Christ. And in that sense, through prayer, through fasting, contemplation, various mystical exercises, the idea is that you become the Grail, that every human being is called to become the Grail, to become the vessel through which divinity is poured out into the world. And from that point of view, then, that's where we begin to approach the Grail as revealed to the knights of the Round Table, etc., on their quest. This is the Grail that is revealed to them. They see it at different times, but it always withdraws into the distance. They have to keep going. They have to purify themselves. The knights who fall to temptation along the way don't get to see it, whereas Percival, the knight who's considered to be the purest of the pure, he's the one who eventually receives the vision of the Grail. Not even Arthur is good enough to see the vision of it. And again, there was a lot of Christian codification in those legends as well. We read them now just as stories, but they were actually stories of meant to kind of catechize, and there's a lot of theology hidden in them. So the Grail resides in the chapel of the Fisher King, and the Fisher King is effectively Christ, the one who is the fisher of men. So he's the king who is constantly on the point of death but never actually dies, again transcending both life and death, and the one who has the way you find him is to follow his bloody footprints. So again the footprints appear, but also the idea of the wounded feet of Christ. So it's the call to be the knight, to be the warrior, to be someone who's pure, but eventually the only way into the chapel to be able to receive from the Grail, Percival receives communion from the Grail itself, is to give up the sword, to give up the way of violence, to give up the way of fighting. And from an allegorical point of view, the knight discovers that all the way along he has actually been fighting himself. That all of these various beasts and trolls and dragons and monsters and giants are actually parts of himself that have to be given away, so that he can become the Grail, the vessel. Again, it's also an indication of the feminine energies within the divine. So space, emptiness, the idea of, and that's not space to be filled or to be to be taken over or to be controlled. But it's the idea of divine spaciousness, a spaciousness that is full, an emptiness without absence. The idea of moving into mystery, moving into the place beyond name and beyond concept, to arrive at a place of spiritual union and silence and stillness. So you have this wonderful moment within the Arthurian legends where Percival goes on, but eventually becomes a hermit himself, and his entire life is spent in just the contemplation of the Grail. So yeah, it's a whole map of the spiritual life when we look at it from that point of view. And it begins, of course, that the whole Grail quest begins with the wild man. It begins with Merlin, who's the one who tells them that in order to heal the land, they must seek the Grail. So that the Round Table is constructed, and even Arthur's birth is brought about so that the Grail might be found. So as to bring reconciliation to the broken land or the warring land. And in that sense, it's the idea that only when we become open to the divine mysteries do we actually arrive at a place of peace within ourselves, the land being the torn up mind and heart of every human being. So Merlin steps in as this wonderful instrument of the other, or of the divine, to actually indicate that this is possible, because he himself is considered to be both human and elemental. He's a what do they call it again? A cambion, which is the result of a union between an incubus and a woman. But he was rescued from his demonic father, because the moment he was born, he was baptized. So in that moment, he's baptized by his master Blaise, who is both a priest and a magician, and set on the path of kind of sacred knowledge. And part of that, of course, is his experience of moving into the woodlands to learn the old powers of shape-shifting and the kind of shamanic initiation, etc., that would be part and parcel of that. So it's in story form an indication of the transformation of the bestial into intellect, and from intellect then into spirit. It's the idea of the land being a sort of a as above, so below idea, that within the microcosm of the human being is written the healing of the macrocosm. And there's also the idea of us effectively realizing that the only way we receive the Grail is to become the Grail.
John and Nay, we're going to kind of combine their questions, because they both mention angels. Nay mentions the three wise men, and we'll just kind of weave this together as the general. So everyone is familiar. I don't know if everyone, but I think most people should be familiar with the nativity scenes that people put out at Christmas. And you have the three wise men, and of course you have Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus, and often there are angels present as well. Yeah.
What would they like to know about angels?
Yeah, I mean, the question about angels, I think that could be 10 or 15 shows on its own. Yeah. So I think we'll just take it in the form of that Christmas, and particularly the nativity scenes. Like, is the idea that there were literal supernatural beings there, at the birth of Christ?
Yeah, yes, I think that's absolutely true. I think the other thing we need to understand is that angel, the word angel refers to the job that a particular spirit has. It's not the name of the kind of spirit it is. Oh. So in Greek, angelos just means messenger. So a spirit who is given a divine message to bring to humankind, that spirit, by virtue of the job, becomes an angel. So the spirits themselves have their own individual eternal divine names that are given to them. And so an archangel, a high angel, is someone who has a very important message. And then we can begin to divide the angels up into the sort of the hierarchy of angels that was known, which is the idea of the 9 choirs. Nothing to do with singing, but the idea of 9 divisions of angels, ranging from the lowest angels, whose jobs are to basically one step above the elemental spirits. They're there for the guidance of the sort of the material universe, etc. So you have angels, then you have archangels, then depending on the hierarchy you choose, to different mystics and saints put it in different ways. But the 9 choirs are effectively angels, archangels, virtues, thrones, principalities, powers, dominions, cherubim and seraphim, going from the bottom to the top. When you reach the seraphim, you're dealing with extraordinary beings whose entire nature is considered to be divine fire and light. So it's love as fire and light, whereas the cherubim are intellect and will. And so all of these kind of powers are present within the sort of the divine presence of angels. So when we begin to talk about them present within the nativity story, I think it's very clear from the scriptures that the scriptures anyway are saying, yes, angels were present and they spoke, and beginning with the Annunciation to Mary through the Archangel Gabriel, who's the messenger par excellence, appears in the Old Testament, the New Testament, etc., whenever there's a very strong divine message to be given. And then moving to the angels who appear to the shepherds and who announce peace and reconciliation. The presence of the angelic orders in the Nativity, though, is very interesting, because in the Old Testament, the angels appear as higher than humankind. They are directing, they are punishing, they are ordering, the humankind or the prophets. And even when prophets sort of bow down before the angels, that they are, that's kind of accepted. Whereas from the New Testament on, the angels appear as equals to human beings, different but equal. There's a wonderful moment in the New Testament where the Apostle John tries to bow down to an angel, and he's immediately told, no, stand up. I'm a servant just like you are. So the incarnation is this lovely moment of healing and renewing humankind, so that humankind can stand up and be part once again of this great union of the spiritual world with the physical, the material with the angelic, etc. So in that sense, the angels are considered to be messengers of peace, messengers of reconciliation, and those who sort of guide humankind into closer and closer union with the divine mysteries of the incarnation itself. So, I mean, as you say, we could easily do 15, 20 shows with the angels. We haven't even mentioned the Anaphim, who are angels who appear as wheels or orbs. We could talk about them some other time if you like. But that's certainly where they would figure within the nativity story anyway.
The sort of I don't know if it's modern or quasi-modern representation of angels as robed winged things.
Yeah.
If you do any sort of digging, you come to that this is a symbol. This is
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
That has been known.
Wonderful.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. No,
that has been known to the laity as a symbol, like say in looking at Renaissance paintings, for instance.
Yeah. Oh, I think very much so, and particularly the cute little cherubs and cherubs and putti and all of those kind of artistic figures. That's about as far away from an angel as you can actually get. What you're dealing with, in fact, is a non-corporeal spirit who has the power, should they will, to take on any aspect or manifestation. C.S. Lewis, in his science fiction trilogy, his adult science fiction trilogy, which includes a lot of angels within it, has this wonderful moment when the angels are preparing to meet the new Adam and Eve of a particular planet. And what's interesting in it is that they're trying to decide how they will appear to these people so as not to frighten them. And they go through all the kinds of shapes, the bull heads and eagle faced and, flaming wings and appearing as fire and light and all of those. And eventually they decide on, we'll just appear like they look themselves so they won't be frightened. Mm-hmm. What Lewis goes on to talk about, though, is this idea that the higher up the spiritual hierarchy you go, the more real the being is. And I think this is a really important thing for people dealing with ghosts or spirits or whatever to understand. We see the spirit as insubstantial because it can move through walls, or it fades away, or it disappears. But what Lewis is saying is that actually we are the ones who are insubstantial. And the spirit is actually more real and moves through us as though we would move through fog. And so that's why messages, etc., that come from them can be sort of out of time or not in sync completely, because they're sort of having to really concentrate to appear to us or to tune into us in a more material way, in a kind of a slower way than they are used to operating at. I think it's a fascinating theory, the idea that the only truly real thing that exists in and of itself, in that it does not need anything else in order to exist, is the divine, is God, in God's self. So once we begin to move down into the angelic hierarchies, which are above us in the sense that they are more spiritual than physical, they are far bigger than anything that we have ever encountered, and they have to condense themselves in order to appear to us or to move in us. And he says himself that that's why the angels prefer speaking in our unconscious or in our dreams rather than having to appear, because it's a lot of work to appear to us physically.
That's really interesting. I struggle a lot and I get more into it in Volume 2, where the footprints end, with the idea of, and I think Patrick Harper probably does a much better job in daemonic reality than I do, in addressing the idea that things can be ephemeral in a sense, and but also physical, and able to leave footprints in the speaking of Bigfoot, to leave hair behind, but also be, and it's a very difficult concept, I think, and here I've been writing about it for years, and it's difficult for me to wrap my head around,
Sure. Well, I mean, there's quite a lot of wonderful monuments and places around the world that include, angels having left footprints. The greatest shrine in honor of the Archangel Michael, who would be considered the greatest of the angels, his name Michael means the one who is like God, or who is nearest to God. One of the most important shrines to him is Monte Gargano in Italy, and it's a cave. It's a full cathedral basilica that exists in a cave underground. And the story is that a young shepherd, following, I think, sheep or cattle that got lost, went into the cave, and this apparition of the archangel took place. And the archangel asked him to have a church built in the cave. And he very reasonably said to the archangel, "Nobody is going to believe me. And why would anybody build a church in a cave?" And so, in order to show that he was actually present, the archangel is supposed to have stepped forward and placed his foot onto stone, and lo and behold, the footprint is there to this day, burned into the rock, the rock having kind of melted around his foot. So I think the idea that these beings, if we want to even call them that, can step in and out of our physical reality and have physical impact is something that's present in all of the traditions and all of the faiths all the way back. Whether that's the ghost of your granny who tips you on the shoulder and tells you not to cross the road, and saves you from a car accident, or the Archangel Michael, or for that matter, the Buddha or the Blessed Virgin or whoever it might be who appears in these apparitions, and has a physical impact. I think we're being told again and again that whether we like it or not, the corporeal and the non-corporeal are two sides of the same coin. One of our old teachers used to say when teaching around this, you yourself are a non-corporeal consciousness affecting corporeal reality just by sitting there, taking up a pencil in your hand and drawing what the image that is present in your mind in that moment. So it's more a matter of scale than a matter of us having to say there is a reality different to our own. It's just where we are on the scale, I think, that makes it difficult for us to understand what's happening around us, above and below.
The way I visualize it in Volume 2 of Where the Footprints End is I told people to take a strip of paper and write, spiritual or ethereal, whatever, however you want to write, and physical, write, ethereal, spiritual, whatever, on one side of it.
Sure.
Physical on the other. And then twist it into a Moebius strip.
Oh, right, okay.
And then if you run your finger along as if you were walking on that strip, you'll find you have to walk the entire surface of that and you will walk across the ethereal and back to the physical before you make the loop again.
Sure.
That's the best way I can explain it, as far as giving someone a model to sort of to work with that.
Yeah. There's a wonderful story. I wish I could remember the book now offhand. I'll try and find it for you. But he was an anthropologist who visited a Tibetan monastery before the Chinese annexation of Tibet. And while he was there doing his studies, he had been invited by the abbot to stay in the monastery and to observe the day-to-day life of the monks. He was doing his kind of work away. But on one occasion, while the monks were in some kind of liturgy or moment of prayer, a drunk man came in through the doors and was making noise and disturbing things. And he wondered how they would deal with it. And he said, by and large, the monks just ignored it and kept going until the man's disruption became so big that it was threatening to kind of disrupt all of the service that was going on. So he said at that point, one elderly monk, detached himself from the crowd, came over to the man, and began to chant. And as he chanted, the anthropologist saw clearly a spot of light appear above the monk's head that got bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually one of the kind of more sort of fierce deities or demons appeared and frightened the drunk man into complete silence, and he ran out. Huh. And he was fascinated seeing this, so he was trying to construct all kinds of theories as to how this could have happened. He said the monk just finished his prayer and went back, and the liturgy went on. Nobody else moved, nobody blinked that this had happened. And afterwards he asked to be received by the abbot. And they were going through his studies, and he said he had to ask the question. So he said, when that happened, he said, I saw this creature, this demon or dragon appear, and he said it frightened the drunk man. And he said the abbot said yes. And he said, well, I've come up with a few theories around it. He said, was it that the chant and the droning was sort of hypnotism, and it hypnotized me into seeing this kind of hallucination, or was it in fact that the prayer had some sort of ability to call some kind of spirit or being, and we saw that, or was it in fact that there was some sort of a projection that happened from the fears of the drunk man seeing the monk coming towards him? And the abbot smiled and said, yes. And that was it.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that we forget about when we're dealing with these things, is that very often it's both and rather than either or. So if for the strange familiar audience, if it's Bigfoot who leaves his footprints and appears to eat food or go through your garbage or whatever it might be, but also disappears and cannot be shot, while people struggle to find reason behind that, I think the older minds and the older traditions, be they Christian or Buddhist or Hindu or Native American or whatever, would have no problem with saying, of course it's real. It's just real in a way that we aren't.
Right.
And I think that's the way we have to deal with these things.
Well, let's move on to the three wise men, and particularly interested in, I think often people wonder why they're called the Three Magi.
Sure. Well, it comes from, the Greek in which the New Testament was originally written. They were referred to as magus or magus, which for the people at the time would have been a very clear indication as to where they came from, that they came from the further east, and were probably part of the Zoroastrian faith, which to this day exists by and large, I think, in modern day Iran, what would have been Persia previously. It's a monotheistic faith. Zoroaster was the prophet who founded it, and not huge to this day in terms of numbers, but it still exists. Probably the most famous Zoroastrian that anybody would know listening in would have been Freddie Mercury, the singer, the head singer of Queen. He was a Zoroastrian and came from a Zoroastrian family. somewhat persecuted now because of they being a minor religion in a very Islamic world, but they still exist, and they're still there. The Magi or Magi were known for the practice of alchemy, the practice of various forms of divination, magic, but above all else astrology. And in those days, astronomy and astrology were one and the same thing. It was they did not divide until very, very much later. And so these three representatives seem to have by what they had observed and by the divination that they had made, they had recognized that whatever was appearing in the heavens was an indication that a prophecy was being fulfilled and a king was being born, and they came to do him homage. They're often referred to as well as the three kings. Now, they're never mentioned in the Gospels as kings. That goes back to a prophecy in the Psalms that says that the kings of Sheba, Seba, and Tarshish will come and will offer their treasures. And so the early Christian writers saw the Magi being the fulfillment of this prophecy. In later medieval tradition, they're seen as three people who come from three different areas. So you'll often see them depicted as a young man, a middle-aged man, and an old man, indicating that we can come to Christ at any age, and that age is no barrier to wisdom, and youth is no barrier to revelation. They'll also often be depicted as an Asian person, a black person, and a white person. And that's supposed to be the indication that, again, the Epiphany is a revelation to all peoples of all places and all times. We actually have an icon here in the monastery that shows one of the Magi as a Celt. So the Irish even got in under the Magi label. But no, they would have been, I suppose, wise people, teachers, traveling magicians as well. I mean, the word magic and magician comes from magus, magi, master. But they would have been seen as masters of esoteric wisdom as well. The gifts they bring are very important because they indicate who Christ is. So one brings gold, which is an indication of royalty, and Jesus' own bloodline through Mary is the Davidic line back to the kings of Israel. They bring frankincense, which is an offering to the divine or to the spiritual world. And they bring myrrh, which was an ointment used to cool the gums of teething babies, and to cool the breasts of breastfeeding women when the breasts were inflamed. So it was a very practical thing to bring to a birth. But it was also used to anoint the bodies of the dead. And so it's seen as a prophecy of the tomb, that Christ is born to die in that sense. The names of the Magi appear from apocryphal gospel tradition, so not within the canon itself, but within fairly early traditions as well, as Gaspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. And their bones, the relics of the Magi, can be venerated in Cologne Cathedral in Germany. And it's a huge, big, long story as to how they got there, but that's where they are to this day. The shrine of the Magi is there. And if you want a connection between the Magi and the fairy people or the little people, there's a wonderful connection that most people don't know of, which is in the earliest iconography of the Magi, because they come from the East and they're Zoroasters, they wore what was called the Phrygian cap, which is a pointed hat, but with the point bent down forwards, facing out over the face. And that is the cap that is seen very often seen on gnomes, and particularly on the Smurfs. Mm-hmm. So it was considered a cap that was a designation of somebody who was a teacher, and someone who knew the mysteries, magical mysteries as well. So in that moment we have the whether it was a conjunction or a celestial light. The way the star is described, I often think that it's far more orb-like than star-like. It seems to wait for them and move and bring them to the place where they need to go. So I think there's more than just a simple celestial alignment going on. But that's the Magi to this day.
Is there any indication of their lives after the Nativity?
Yeah, there's all kinds of legends and stories that they became. They sort of brought the news of the birth back to their particular places and countries, and that they prepared for the coming of the apostles and disciples, so that they were ready. Their people were ready to receive the faith. Now, that's all legendary. We know nothing of historically of what happens after they sort of leave the stage and are warned by an angel again to go back a different way, because Herod wants to use them to find out where Jesus is. So again, it's also the idea that this incarnation, this Messiah who's being born, is not being born just for the Jewish people, but is being born for all people. And so even the pagans, in inverted commas, receive the revelation from the very beginning. And that was extremely important for the attitude of Christianity towards the pagan traditions in the beginning as well, because it was felt that if the revelation from the very beginning had already been offered to the pagans, and that these people, without the benefit of the scriptures or the Jewish tradition, were able to find Christ, then it was possible that in their wisdom and in their teachings and in their tradition, the seed of Christ was present. So the early fathers spoke of what they called the logios spermatikoi, which was the seeds of the divine word. And they said that these are present in the hearts of every people, believer and unbeliever alike. And it's wherever a human being intends or looks towards the good, the compassionate, the kind, that these are the seeds planted by the divine word, by the Logos, so as to invite eventual belief and eventual communion. And one of the most important things was not to disturb the seeds. So simply because I want you to be like me, and I think I've got the answers, whoever I am, the warning was always to go very, very gently, lest you crush the seeds that the divine has planted, so that these people will come to the fullness of truth in the fullness of time.
I think that's a beautiful lesson that often gets lost.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
So we'll skip Steve's little questions for us. We'll come back to them, and we'll move to Chad's questions, which are a little deeper here. He says, in what ways can I include St. Francis's teachings into my life? Where's a good place to start?
Wow. Well, if he's looking for reading material or books, I would say, there's huge biographies and very erudite studies of Francis and the early followers. But I would suggest to him there's two books that have stood the test of time. The first is G.K. Chesterton wrote a beautiful biography of St. Francis. It's very Chestertonian, as you would expect. There's lots of puns and wit all the way through, but it's well worth reading. The other is by a more contemporary follower of St. Francis, a friar by the name of Marie Bodo, who wrote a beautiful poetic reflection on the life of Francis and his teachings called The Journey and the Dream. I'd start with the two of those in terms of basic understanding of his life and his teachings. Francis, by the way, is very associated with Christmas because it was St. Francis who began the custom of the Christmas crib, of the manger scene. He began that custom in 1223 in a little town called Greccio, where he set up a life-size cave and brought in an ox and a donkey and had people pose as the various figures so as to make the gospel story come alive again for them. And a very old custom because of that, going right the way back to Francis, was that the straw that was used in the manger was collected up afterwards, and they discovered that any sick animals that lay on the straw or were fed the straw recovered. And to this day, in Ireland anyway, and in many other places, Italy particularly, once the Christmas Mass is over, there is a melee of people who run to the manger scene to get the blessed straw. And some of that is brought back. And the traditions around it are that if you have some of the straw in your purse or in your wallet, it won't be empty for the year ahead. You'll always have enough to support you. The other idea was then that if anybody was sick or any animals were sick on the farm, then some of the straw was kept to be given to them as a remedy. For human beings, the straw was dipped in water and then the water was drunk. For the animals, the straw was just given to them to eat. And some of it was usually kept over the fireplace or over the door, again, as a protection against evil. So that goes back to St. Francis. But in terms of his teachings, I think the essential teaching of St. Francis is that if God is the origin of us all, then we are all one family. And that means I am required, when I come into contact with another being, be that human or non-human, to recognize in that a fundamental brotherhood or sisterhood. And so I start always from an equality rather than a dominance. When Francis founded his order, the proper title, the full title of the order is the Order of Friars Minor, which means the Order of Little Brothers. And that was what he wanted. It was little brothers and little sisters who were there for people in their need. And your very way of life becomes the sermon. Words weren't that important to St. Francis at all. In fact, he recommended preachers to preach a very short word, is his quote on it. And there's a lovely story of him on one occasion saying to one of the brothers, "Come, let's go and preach a sermon today." And they go through the whole day silent, but helping people. And at the end of the day, the brother says, "We never preached." And Francis says, "Our whole day was our sermon." So I think there's a lot to that, particularly in a world that is soaked in people, arguing and fighting. To simply be with people in their need is one of the most important elements.
I think one of the most famous, and people may see, statues of St. Francis holding birds and
Sure.
the idea of the preaching to the birds, right? Is this viewed as something he literally did, or is this more of a symbolic thing?
100% something he literally did. And the Strange Familiar listeners are going to be delighted, because the actual translation from the Italian is he preached to the crows, not just to the birds in general. He's often seen these flocks of sparrows and robins and all kinds of birds around him, but he specifically went for the crows to preach to them. And if you go to Assisi and climb the mountain above Assisi to where the Hermitage is, they will show you the stump of the tree on which the crows landed to hear him preach.
Oh, wow.
It's still there to this day. Within the stories of Francis, over and over again, his ability to connect to the natural world in a very supernatural way, it was manifest over and over again. There's legend after legend after legend, and when I say legend, I mean what we call a legenda, which means a written down story by the first followers of his, who were astounded themselves to see everything from insects to falcons to what we would, I suppose, talk about the non-material. Francis would also speak to water, and it would do what he wanted it to do. He would speak to fire, and it would do what he wanted it to do. Towards the end of his life, he was very sick and was going blind. And unfortunately, in the medieval understanding of medicine at the time, because his eyes were weeping constantly, well, that was water. So you fixed water by bringing the element of fire. And a doctor with a hot poker cauterized both his eyes. It didn't do anything for the blindness. But the story as presented by the doctor is that, he was expecting the friars to have to hold Francis down, as they would any patient who was going to have this done. And Francis said to him there was no need to do that as long as he got to speak to the fire first. So he spoke to the fire and said, "Brother Fire, I've always looked after you and I've always loved you, and you've always been very kind and good to me, and so now in my hour of need, I need you to be good to me once again." And he was cauterized just sitting there with the poker without any pain or without any suffering.
Wow.
So again, I think the contemplative mind, the meditative mind, has a way of dealing with reality in maybe a more unitive way than we are used to dealing with. And I mean, we know this, we've seen this. There are so many people from all traditions who I think when their life is transformed by compassion and by kindness, animals know children know. Yeah, we used to say that if you really want to know the heart of someone, see how a child reacts to them, see how an animal reacts to them, and they very often let you know very quickly and very directly whether they like someone or not. So There you go.
So Chad continues, and he wants to know some good things to keep in mind in dealing with the other. And I'll add in my own question, or my own second to his question, I suppose. There, lately it's come up often in interviews I've done on other podcasts and stuff, and I've sort of taken to saying now I know some people are just drawn to it, and they will hear me speak about it and hear other people talk about it, and they will have to seek it out. There's going to be no stopping them. They're of a curious nature.
Sure.
But I've taken to saying to people, like, if you can just enjoy the experience through others, through listening to other people's stories, or reading books, or watching documentaries, or what have you.
Sure.
That's certainly an easier way to go about it, and I would I would recommend doing that if you're able to do that. But at this point, it's kind of my job. I kind of established it as my job, and so I guess let's maybe talk about some safe ways to approach it, and some wise ways to approach it.
I think primarily the first thing I would say is don't let it call you away from your humanity. So in other words, the human things need to be the most important things in your life. And that means relationships, it means family, it means your job, it means your health. And if it begins to affect any of those things, you need to take a step back and a pause. And I think it's really important to have somebody in your life you trust enough, who's grounded enough, whether that's a spouse or a partner or a friend or a teacher or whatever it might be, who's able to tip you on the shoulder and say, you're going there again. You need to step back now. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is you need to preserve totally a sense of humor and accept going into it, you are not going to solve it. I think that's really important. It will always be far, far bigger than any of us. The most we can do is find ways of being with it, I think, that are safe. And that calls for mutual respect. So I think definitely, I mean, you often talk about the rules of folklore and things like that. And they built up over thousands of years so that people would know that there are ways of being respectful and safe. The other thing is, if someone was interested in your life, would you want them, walking into your house and stomping all over your place and taking things that maybe belonged to you just because they were interested in who you are? So I think to accord the level of respect that you would hope would be accorded to you by a stranger or by anybody else. Ask for permission for things. Slow down and be reflective enough to listen for the answers. And if the answers don't come immediately, don't force things. I think it's really important for people to have a prayer or a meditative practice themselves that they are solid in. Whatever the tradition is that they belong to or not, but just something that affords them spiritual protection and a groundedness in making sure that they don't surrender their will. I think that's a very important thing. Not to surrender will and not to surrender, let's call it energy, shall we? Most people are happy enough with that as a word. So if you find that you're suddenly sick a lot, or you're feeling drained and tired and exhausted a lot, look at yourself. It might be that you're just overdoing things. I think we need to be very careful of not immediately going to a supernatural explanation for everything. Sure, Sometimes a flu is just a flu. But I think it's important to mind ourselves, our bodies, our minds, our hearts. And there are wonderful, we talked about the angels. There are wonderful interactions with wonderful beings who desire only our good and our growth. But it's an ecosystem, as you said last time, and an ecosystem includes predators. And you need to be careful of that. So I think lots of protection. Read the folklore of old know the protective practices and prayers and blessings. Don't be afraid to seek advice and assistance. And the other thing I'd say is to approach it with an intention that's good. And if you are walking out into hopeful interaction with all of this, while being paranoid and fearful, that's what it will sense, and it will know that, and that's what you get back. I think you've got to have a very authentic sense of yourself before you go into participation in this. I'd also warn a little bit about practices that are divinatory or that are invoking spirits or things like that, simply because most people don't have the resources to deal with that kind of stuff. Years ago, I was asked about Ouija boards, for example, and people were saying, they're fantastic and they're one of the simplest ways of dealing with things. And what they forget is that all of these methods are effectively us opening a door into our own consciousness and then waiting for whatever happens to be passing by at the time. If you open your hall door tomorrow and go across the street and sit and watch what happens, you might very well get a lovely good neighbour who comes to you and says, do you know your hall door is open? You need to close it. But you might also, by the time you get back, have nothing left in your house.
Right, yeah.
So I think, we need to be careful about these things, and to presume that we know everything is a very, very dangerous thing. I mean, it's often been said on your program, and I agree with it wholeheartedly, that the moment you think you know, that's the moment the world turns upside down. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think that's it. And also a good sense of humor, and just making sure that you have other interests as well as this. If it becomes obsessive, if anything becomes obsessive, it's bad for the human being. And this is just one of those things too.
Absolutely. I will say, I don't know if I'm a good Catholic boy, that's someone else's judgment to make, but the Hail Mary has served me well in some pretty scary situations. It's just that's my go-to, and it's very centering. And I mean, there was Chad and I do a solstice walk, and we were on the top of a mountain last year. It was 8 degrees, and we started seeing weird lights and started getting kind of a little bit scary, and I just went right there and calmed down.
Sure.
But your mileage may vary. Well, but for me, that's my sort of centering, almost as a mantra.
Sure, and I think the obviously I would 100% approve of the Hail Mary, but I think it's really important for people to know that when whatever way we call out for help arrives. Mm-hmm. The important thing is to call out if need be, and the other thing is if we willingly put ourselves into situations that are definitively dangerous, I think we need to be sort of careful of that too, and that's why all of the traditions have their protective practices, all of them, So, and I think it's very important for people to realize that there's a broadness to these traditions, a commonality in terms of the things that they offer. I saw a very interesting thing some days ago online where somebody was talking about salt and the importance of salt in protective rituals, and somebody responded by asking, well, what about the different kinds of salt then? Like, I mean, does it need to be Himalayan salt? Does it need to be organic salt? Does it need to be purified salt or whatever? And I was thinking of one of our really, really extraordinary individuals in terms of all of this ministry of stuff. He's gone to God now, but in his years when he needed salt, he would just go to the kitchen and pick up the ordinary table salt and take that with him, and off he would go. Because I think once we realize that it's not necessarily the virtue of the thing itself, it's the intention that opens the virtue of the thing. So then it works, and we don't need to get caught up in exact brands or anything else like that. But just to work with it gently, I think, and to make sure that you've got people in your life who are able to tip you on the shoulder and say, enough of that for a while now, you need to do ordinary things,
Yeah, I would add to that, trust your gut a little bit as well.
Oh yeah,
if it's
yeah.
saying leave, maybe it's time to go.
Well, one of the most difficult things at the moment that's out there is people are living such busy lives and such fast lives and such reactive lives that often they don't know how to listen to their gut anymore. And, the mere fact of living very reactive, fast lives means we don't pick up on signals as quickly as we should. And so, unfortunately, people only realize that the dog doesn't want them there when it bites them because they never listened for the growl. And the growl is there, you'll pick it up very, very quickly if you're aware enough. And so I think where people get very caught up in all of the technology around these kind of things, rather than actually just sitting, being still, being aware, opening their minds to what's around them, noticing the acoustic signals, the smell signals, the gut signals that are there, they'll often guide you far, far better than a lot of the technology that's out there now for all of this.
Absolutely. All right, so let's move on to Steve's list of questions for us, or first choice. And I don't know if some of these seem like they're meant for me. Some, who knows? But we'll just go through them here. Okay. He says, Bigfoot or Sasquatch? So.
Oh, I'll go Sasquatch.
Okay, yeah. For me, it's Bigfoot. Just I think it's a very. I guess it comes from pop culture, but
sure.
It's, whatever. It's very common, very easy term. Krampus or Saint Nick?
Well, now I'm going to have to go Saint Nicholas, haven't I?
I will too. I appreciate the Krampus stories, but he doesn't seem like a real fun guy. Residual or active? I guess he means hauntings with that. I'm not sure. I'll take either one. Well, I guess.
I'll go active. Active is much easier to deal with than residual.
Oh, is it?
Because you can have a conversation.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, if it's active and there's a real presence, then it's possible to actually get information and have a conversation. Residual is often just a mess of cross emotions and emotional states that has all kinds of lesser little entities then jumping on and being part of it. Oh. So you end up with a kind of it's the difference between dealing with a sort of a face-to-face conversation rather than a crossed telephone line where you're trying to find out exactly what voice is speaking when.
Very, very interesting. I hadn't even thought about it. Okay, next, Lily Munster or Morticia Addams.
I always loved the Addams family cartoons, so I'll go with the Addams.
Yeah, Morticia was as a very, very young boy. She was my first crush, so I have to go with Morticia.
Oh, there you go.
Ouija or scrying? I think you just laid down some warnings that I would probably equal to both of those. Yeah.
Yeah. The only form of scrying that I think has any kind of merit from a meditative point of view would be the kind of psychomantium, which because it's a kind of a more passive experience of just simply sitting and gazing. But again, a lot of the contemplative teachers would say that the idea of having to use tools or apparatus is always dangerous. You're better to try and work with the internal mirror of the soul if possible.
Poltergeist or demon? I don't know who would choose demon, but
oh, I would choose poltergeist, definitely. Yeah. Much easier to deal with. Yeah.
Nightmare Before Christmas or A Christmas Carol? I'll go with A Christmas Carol on that one.
Oh, okay. I'd go with A Christmas Carol as well, I think. Though I love both.
Yeah. Wassail or eggnog?
Neither. I don't drink alcohol.
We go with a non-alcoholic eggnog.
There you go.
Fairies or greys? I'm not sure there's a difference anymore, but
yeah, I think they're one and the same. To be honest, that's a both and. That's a like the Tibetan abbot's response. It's I think it's yes. I think they might. There's certainly very, very close ties and relations. But if I had to meet one on the street and deal with it, I would prefer to deal with one that was appearing as a fairy rather than as a grey.
I think I'd agree. Although my last encounter where I don't know if you heard me talk about where they were.
I did, yeah,
like,
I did, yeah.
Dressed in weird feathers and dancing around. That was almost amusing. That I'll take. But as far as previous ones, I'd take anything but. I was not very fond of this. Sleep paralysis or out of body. I did not like sleep paralysis when I had it. So
out of body, I would agree completely.
Day hike or night hike? I'll take a day
night hike for me.
I'm sorry, your answer?
I'd go night hike, yeah.
Really?
I spent many beautiful nights, out in the forests and woods at night, yeah.
I go with day only because my first symptom, I guess I had MS before.
Sure.
But my first symptom of MS, I went blind in my left eye. And very quickly I got a pain around my eye, and then within days I could only see light and dark. And thankfully I had treatment, steroids, and I got 90% or more of my vision back. So it ended up being fine. But one of the lasting effects of that is I have trouble with contrast at night. So it's very difficult for me to see on night hikes. And it makes them. I like to see things, so
sure.
So it makes them less fun for me than they were. Lute or bagpipes?
Well, I'll be a Celt and I'll go bagpipes definitely. Yeah.
I love anything with a reedy drone. I like that bagpipes or harmoniums or anything like that. I absolutely love them. Solstice or equinox?
Equinox is more powerful than the solstices, believe it or not. But I'd from the significance of them, I would go solstice.
I do enjoy, especially winter solstice. I just absolutely love it. It's just absolutely one of my favorite times of the year. Now, I don't even know if you
remind me at the end to tell you something about the solstice. Go on anyway. Sorry.
Okay. I don't even know if the Pennsylvania Dutch pot pie are real pot pie with an actual crust. So let me explain.
Okay.
I grew up in Maryland, just 20 miles away from where we are now, and pot pie was different. Pot pie had a crust on it. And I come to Pennsylvania, and somebody says, "Do you want pot pie for dinner?" I said, "Oh, sure, I love pot pie." And they give me a bowl of noodles. And so it actually comes from, what is it, Bot Boy? Is that the Pennsylvania Dutch?
It's a German.
Yeah. I don't know that you would have ever experienced the difference, but I actually prefer, having grown up with pot pie with a crust, I actually prefer the noodle pot pie. But I don't know if you have any do they have a pot pie in Ireland?
Well, we certainly have pies and things like that, but I think I wouldn't have the technical knowledge to answer correctly there. But I mean, if it's got pastry, I'm happy. So that's okay. I'll deal with pastry.
Dungeons and Dragons or Magic the Gathering?
Oh, Dungeons and Dragons all the way. Though answering it that way, my youngest brother is also a listener to your podcast. And he is he's very involved in the comic business. He has a comic and sci-fi shop. So he Magic the Gathering, I think, has made a lot of money for him over the years in terms of selling all the cards and things like that. But I'm a 70s, 80s kid, so I definitely Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, I grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons. My mother loved Dungeons and Dragons because she said I had this vast jump in my vocabulary shortly after starting playing that. So it's educated a lot of people over the years. Yeah. And then last is eBay or Etsy.
I think Etsy definitely.
Yeah, Etsy's been good to me this year, so I'll go with Etsy as well. All right, so your solstice story.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So many years ago, I was contacted by a family who they're in what we would call an Irish ascendancy family. So they would have been descended from Protestant landowners who came in during the kind of plantation and put down roots in Ireland. So very, very wealthy family, very well connected politically, all of that kind of stuff. So it was very unusual that they'd be in touch with any of us. But anyway, this gentleman was passed on to me because he was expecting his first child to be born. And he was very worried because he was convinced that there was a curse on the family that affected firstborn children down the generations. So I asked him why and where was this story coming from, etc. And he said, well, it was because his great grandfather had worked for the colonial service in Africa for the British government in the days when they owned as much of the world as they did. And this gentleman had had a run-in with a chief of a particular tribe in Nigeria where he was working at the time. Nigeria or Kenya, I can't remember, it was either Nigeria or Kenya. And this had escalated to the point where the man had broken into one of their sacred enclosures and had stolen two of their images of their deities, and was basically holding them to ransom to try and get the chief to agree to his terms of some particular piece of land management. Anyway, a couple of nights later, the man woke up to discover that his house was now surrounded by a group of men who were chanting and singing and drumming and all of that kind of stuff. And he was told afterwards that his family had been cursed until the deities would be returned. So he poo-pooed the whole thing and refused to return them. And when he left Africa to return to Ireland, he took the deities with him, the two statues with him. From the moment they arrived in Ireland, the family had terrible misfortune after misfortune, bad luck. And whenever a son was born to the family, the son was born sick. Not conditions that severely limited their health, but just very sick. So anyway, that had come down the generations to this particular man now. So my question was, the minute I heard it, was, well, where are these statues? And he said, well, we still have them. They're in the house. Wow. And I said, have you ever tried to return them? So he said, no. And I said, well, you're going to have to return them. So he said, well, is there anything we can do before we return them? Because this kid is going to be born any day now. So I said, okay, well, if you bring the statues into us, we'll see what happens. So it was round about the solstice at the time. So I was very aware of this and saying, gosh, we're really, all these conditions are kind of coming together. So I'd only spoken to him by phone at that stage. So he arranged to come to the friary where I was living and to bring the two statues with him. And the friary was kind of hard to find, so I was standing out on the road to be able to direct him in. And while I was standing there, completely empty street, I heard two voices behind me, and they said, hello, both at the same time. And I turned round, and there were two African children standing behind me. And I said, hello, and I was totally surprised, didn't know where they'd come from. And they said, we're lost. And I said, okay. I said, where do you need to go? And they said, we're trying to find the place where we can sing. So I said, okay. Now they were dressed in ordinary, modern, Western clothes. Mm-hmm. It was a beautiful, bright day. There was, traffic going up and down, and I was standing with these two kids. So I said to them, look, I can try and find you a place, but, I was talking about various churches and choirs, and I was telling them about, the center, and all the while they just stayed very silent, just looking at me. And at the end they said, we're still trying to find the place to sing. So at that moment I heard a car beep its horn, and I turned around, and there was the gentleman arriving in. And I turned back to where the two kids were, and they were gone. So at that stage I said, okay, we're dealing with real stuff here now. This isn't just his imagination or the family story or whatever. There's real things that have happened here. So I went in, and he arrived at this two-seater sports car with the two statues sitting in the other seat. I'll always remember. Anyway, and brought in the two statues. And the minute he brought them into the friary, I knew immediately that the presences were still with us. They were still with these two statues. So we began the prayer of blessing and prayer and ritual, and I invited the presence of the ancestors of this tribe to be present. And the room was palpably filled. And we had two very ancient, elderly African men just appear. They were there, present in the room. Now, the gentleman who brought them in didn't see them, but he felt that they were there. I saw them. The two of them turned up. So I greeted them, and they greeted me, and they said, the first thing they said to me was, where are we? So I said, you're in a monastery in Ireland. And they said, we need to go home. And I said, yes. And I said, this gentleman gave his name. I said, he's about to make a promise to send you home. And he looked at me all wide-eyed and open-mouthed because he knew what was happening. So I turned around to him and I said, you have to apologize on behalf of your family, and you have to promise you will send these statues back home. So he made the promise and apologized and was overcome with a huge wave of emotion, was absolutely sobbing. And the two presences thanked him and basically just faded out. And we were left with the two statues and him. And I had to get him a very, very strong cup of coffee at that point to try and put him back on his feet and restore him. So I said to him, you've made a promise. You have to fulfill this promise. It'll be far worse for you if you don't fulfill this promise now. So about 2 days later, I got a phone call from him to say that he had gone to the embassy of the particular country and had walked in with these two statues and had said to whoever was at the reception, gave a potted version of the story, did not say he had seen presences or anything else, but said they had to be returned. And, the family were aware that these had been stolen and that they needed to go back. So he was asked to wait, and a little while later, a gentleman appeared on the staff of the embassy who was actually a member of this particular tribe, and thanked him profusely and said, do you know what they are? And he said, no. He said, these are the images of the guardian spirits of our tribe. And he said they're very, very powerful and very strong. And he asked him, has your family been okay? And he said, well, no, we've had issues and all the rest of it. And he said, well, it ends today. And he took them back in, and that was the last he ever saw of them. Wow. Child was born, and child was born fine. But ever since, whenever the solstice has come around, I've always remembered those two little children turning up looking for a place to sing.
Yeah, that's amazing. Chilling.
And, yeah. We're looking. Now, they were very peaceful. Mm-hmm. There was no feeling of animosity or anything. But I was being very clearly told, I think, that what you're about to deal with is real, and to deal with it in a real way.
Wow.
So whenever solstices come around, I'm always aware of it, because in the Celtic tradition, it was believed, the Celtic Christian tradition, it was believed that the solstice was an echo of what they called the 5 great moments of stillness. So they said that the universe became still 5 times throughout its history. The first was the moment of creation itself, when the stars had to be asked to move for the first time. The second time was the moment just before Adam and Eve fell, that all of creation paused to see what were they going to do. Would they give in to the temptation, or would they resist it? And the third moment was the moment of the moment when the angel Gabriel asks Mary, will she be the mother of Christ? The whole of creation stops and pauses at that moment. But the last moment, which comes back to our Christmas, the fourth moment, I should say, the fifth moment is the very end of all time, but the fourth moment in between is the moment when, at the nativity scene, the way the Celtic Christians told the story was that when it came for the moment for Jesus to be born, the midwife, Joseph is looking for a midwife, and he finds this woman on the street, and she says, yes, I'm a midwife, and she comes in. And the first thing she does, being a good midwife of that time, is she throws him out. Says, no, this is women's place and women's place only. And he goes out and goes to the inn to try and get food and drink and things like that. And when he comes out of the inn, he notices that the whole of Bethlehem is completely still, that the birds flying in the sky have stopped dead, that the snow or the rain that's falling is, frozen in time. And it's just for one moment. And at the end of that moment, he hears a child cry. And he realizes the child has been born, and then everything goes back to movement again. And the teaching behind it was that the Christ, or our consciousness of the divine, is born out of stillness, and our awareness of the spiritual world is born out of stillness. And when he goes back, he discovers that the midwife has disappeared, and he asks Mary who the midwife was, and she said, "Surely you recognized her?" And he says, "No, I have no idea who she is." And it turns out that the midwife is Eve, who has been brought through time to witness the fulfillment of the promise made to her all those millennia ago, right, that humanity would be healed by another woman. So it's a wonderful telling, and it's within that Celtic understanding of story and eternity and time and stillness and all of those things. But it always echoes for me that experience as well, that through place and time, these presences were still present and were still reaching out for help. and for assistance. That the ancestors are always present with us. So,
wow.
As we move into a Christmas experience, I'd really hope that all of the people out there, the strange familiar listeners, etc., whatever else happens, that they get a moment of stillness in the midst of it all.
That is a wonderful story. I hate to. I just have to ask a couple questions.
Of course. Feel free.
I'm still the host of Strange Familiars. As much as part of me says just let that go and let that be the end of the episode. And
No.
Say Merry Christmas, but the host of Strange Familiars has to say. So these children appeared as just natural, real children. They
about maybe 8 to 10 years of age. The only thing was I didn't see them arrive along a straight street, and I didn't see them go.
Mm-hmm. And the ancestors that appeared, when you doing the prayers, did they appear in modern garb or some sort of?
No, they were in, I suppose, what you'd call kind of traditional clothing. Colorful African kind of robes, I suppose. Yeah, that kind of idea. Yeah.
Wow.
But again, just because they were appearing as that to me means they may have just used whatever was in my imagination or mind as what they would look like,
Yeah. Oh, that's just absolutely a wonderful story. And again, this note of sort of cross-cultural participation in the other, and that idea that what is good, as you said at the start of all this.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. No, I mean this was the experience of that family was, a very negative experience, right. But actually what they were dealing with was a very positive, very positive objects. They were about protection, they were about peace, they were about connection with the ancestors. So because they had transgressed against that balance, they had run into difficulty. And again, it speaks to your earlier question around, things I should know when dealing with the other, which is, I think we need to be very careful of, just because we're in a particular cultural mindset or we follow a particular set of beliefs or whatever, that when we walk into somebody else's space, whoever they are, we're walking on, holy ground as such, and we need to be very careful.
Absolutely. Brother Richard, thank you so much. Thank you for coming back.
You're most welcome. Thank you, and thank you for all that you're doing. I think the podcast and the community around it, and occasionally I dip in and out of the Discord and the group and things like that, and on Facebook, and it's marvelous to see people from all traditions and all spaces, not just sharing stories, but working with all of this in the sense of understanding, and there's been some marvelous insights, and I mean I've grown in my appreciation of different elements in different ways, listening to you, listening to the podcast, and listening to the other people who contribute as well. So thank you for the work.
I'm very happy and impressed with there seems to be maybe at some point it'll be a problem, but there has not been a problem with people just being respectful and kind to each other. And that's very, very important to me. If I'm going to have a Discord, if I'm going to have the Facebook group, that's the main thing I want. I want people to be kind to each other and be respectful. And we might not all believe the same thing, but that doesn't mean we can't be, again, just kind and respectful to each other.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that the more circles in life we have where we meet different thinkers and different people, and in a way that's open and listening, is that's what's going to improve this world more than anything else.
I'm gonna let Allison step in and ask a question.
I was just thinking about a certain specialness about people who died during, what was it, during the days between Christmas and...
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Is there an equivalent for people who are born during that time?
Yes, yeah, very much so. It was considered a very special blessing, and that they would probably have qualities that would keep them linked to the other side very easily.
Like our kids.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah, it was always considered a very a kind of a thin place. So people who were born or passed away in that place, would have qualities that would kind of keep them present to both sides.
Wonderful. Well, once again, thank you, Brother Richard, and Merry Christmas to you. And
Merry Christmas to you and to Alison and to the family there.
Absolutely. Keep us all in your prayers, and we will as well, likewise. And
thank you so much, and I look forward to Strange Familiars every week, so thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for listening to The Flowered Path. You can always find more information at thefloweredpath.com. You can find The Flowered Path on Facebook. It's facebook.com/thefloweredpath. On Instagram, we're at The Flowered Path. And search for us on YouTube. Please subscribe to our channel there as well. Thank you for listening. And just a reminder, there will be more Brother Richard on Strange Familiars this coming week.